Hi, my name is Pillay,
My name is Janaka Jayawickrama.
and we're talking to you today from the University of York. But I'm originally from South Africa,
I'm originally from Sri Lanka.
and we are going to present this presentation to you on violence against women and health, talking about the double bind of crises, transformation, and well being of women and girls.
And we are conducting this presentation as a discussion between us rather than talking to the slides. So, the outline of this presentation to explain that we both are coming into this presentation with an accumulated 60 years of field experiences on working with violence against women, mainly Anu, and I'm from the humanitarian sector. While we understand and engage with theoretical perspectives, we take what is useful from there to facilitate transformation and well being on the ground. If it is not useful, we don't use them. In this presentation, we combine our experiences with some perspectives from the capabilities approach, originally developed by Amartya Sen, but then took further by Martha Nussbaum.
So, Janaka, um, in our experience, let's talk a little bit about how world conflicts and the effects of uneven development are on the increase. So, what has been your experience?
I think since 1948, the end of the Second World War gave the rise to the current humanitarian structure, if you like, um, and we established the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the United Nations system. And over the years, through the Cold War, and also then coming into the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then more importantly, the 1994 Rwandan genocide gave quite a lot of influences to the humanitarian system and the crises. However, from the 2001 September 11th, the Twin Tower attacks in the United States changed the world in terms of crises, its nature, and also the humanitarian responses. And what we saw during the Cold War is that most of the European and North American countries didn't implemented human rights in the international work simply because we didn't wanted the Russian side to have human rights. So only in 1993 we established the Commissioner for Human Rights in the UN system. So that actually allowed us to look at women and girls within these human rights and protection frameworks, and specifically last 20 years, we have seen the rise of conflicts all around the world. But not only that, but we see a lot of natural hazards increasing from tsunamis to landslides to earthquakes. And also within the last 10 years, mainly stemming from European and North American context, we have started to see a lot of uneven development happening all around the globe.
Right. And I think that what we really are concerned about, because my work as a gender advisor has come into this whole thing because of this focus on women and girls and the recognition that gender is a very important aspect to consider in humanitarian affairs. We are also seeing that the response itself has not been really able to work in such a way that women and girls are really safe and are benefiting from the protection mechanisms that are put in place. What we're seeing is more and more that women and girls are more at risk in than others. When we say other human beings, but we mean men really. That women and girls are more at risk, and that the humanitarian responses, instead of working to provide um, an increased safety for women and girls, they actually place them more at risk.
So, what do you think, Anu, in terms of our argument? What we are looking at is that there are already policies in place in discussion of women and girls. However, what we both agree is that these policies needs to be extended.
And I think what we struggling with in these humanitarian response mechanisms is how to operationalize these policies and frameworks in a way that are really effective. What we're seeing is that while there's this recognition that these policies and frameworks need to be gendered and include um, mechanisms to deal with the issue of women and girls in crisis situations, the operationalization is inadequate, I would say. It's not. It doesn't really work to create a situation where the needs and um, of women and girls are taken into account.
And I think in many ways, in the humanitarian responses across the world, what we have seen, that women and girls are being labeled as vulnerable, but there is a very minimum level of understanding of their capabilities and their aspirations, as affected population. And I think what we both agree here is that there is a huge need to examine the importance of the context in terms of social, political, cultural, economic, and environmental realities of women and girls in those
And I
contexts.
think the basis of the argument is that there's all this talk, about the new way of working and the grand bargain and all these policies and frameworks which place a lot of emphasis on localization, which means that they're really looking at a bottom up approach, but there isn't a really clear way that they spell out in what that means in operational terms. What
Yeah.
does it actually mean? And it doesn't actually spell out also how important it is to take the context into account in terms of the social, political, cultural, economic, and environmental realities.
So, in terms of the health context or health frameworks we are using in the humanitarian sector, rather than examining the definition here, what we are trying to figure out here is that the definition of WHO on health has not been amended since 1948. In that, I think there are very many political and global influences that we need to understand.
And I think that we have to take into account that in 1948, when these definitions were created and formulated, this was a very male dominated world. The humanitarian sector was a very, very male dominated world and still is to a large extent. And driven by these understandings that did not include the realities of women's lives, especially taking violence against women into account at that time. So these definitions are quite limited in the way that they've been understood in terms of health, and particularly uh, um, the word well-being that was put in there. It was never really expanded for us to really understand what was meant by that.
So, discussing this definition, what we found quite important here is that the definition, however, incorporates well being under the concept of health. There is a strong link given in this definition between health and well being. And that means an individual is not completely healthy unless they have well being, without recognizing that health and well being are not necessarily interdependent states.
And then if you put a layer of crisis on top of this definition, so when we already don't understand what that means, and then you have this situation where everything is in flux. We don't recognize often in this situation that the agency and capabilities of women that already exist, they don't get incorporated and appreciated into that. And then women get forced into this double bind of caring for others and surviving the violence that they're being exposed to at that time at the expense of their health and well-being needs.
And I think in that it is very important to understand the social, political, cultural, economic, and environmental challenges to the well being of women and girls in the context of conflicts, disasters, or uneven development.
Yeah.
And this is a definition that came into to play with my experiences of growing up in Sri Lanka, but also working and collaborating with various communities in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, where in many philosophies, local religions, and belief systems, that people consider dangers and uncertainties as part of being human. And in that, well being is the competence to live with uncertainty. As an example, we all die one day and we don't know when it's going to happen. In that uncertainty, how do we make sure that we deal with the uncertainties and dangers presented by life? And what tools, mechanisms we have to deal with them is quite important.
And I think this is a very important shift from the way that we look at what we are exposed to in a crisis. That this is seen to be an unusual situation, whereas we are saying that dangers and uncertainties are part of everyday life. And if you have the capacity to deal with that, you are much more able to deal with a crisis when it happens.
So, when we look at crises from a gendered perspective, what we need to understand is that all societies put women and children in disadvantaged positions through structural mechanisms, particularly through the patriarchal constructions. When includes the layers of conflicts or disasters or uneven development, women and girls are at greater risk of continued forms of violence, including sexual violence. And what is interesting here is that these layers are not only expose them to more violence but also create hidden discriminatory practices within responses. And I think this is what we are going to present in this or discuss in this presentation through looking at these type of violence through our case studies.
And I think what's important to recognize is that the humanitarian actors themselves come with, all kinds of attitudes and behaviors and practices themselves that that add to the hidden discriminatory practices. So it's not to, it's to recognize that this is part of why the response can be very discriminatory towards women and girls.
So for the way to present this, we are looking at social, cultural, political, economic, and environmental violence, not necessarily from the known elements of disasters, conflicts, and uneven development, but looking at how are we optimizing these violences or forms of violences within responses as well.
And also to put forward the argument that we are unpacking this idea of social well-being that is within that definition from the World Health Organization, which doesn't actually give us that understanding of what do we mean by that. And what we're saying is this is what it means. If we unpack it, it needs to include these elements.
So our first example is looking at social violence, and this is a case study coming from Western Darfur, where this photograph explains this particular water pump, which was built under the decision of the displaced committee in this particular camp. What was interesting was in the background you see the compound of the community leader, and the committee was consisted of all men. What you can see here is during the daytime it never presented a problem, but in the evenings women in the camp had to walk through the dark with all the risks and dangers of collecting water.
Right. And I think this is, a very good example of social violence, because this is women are relegated to doing roles, stereotypical roles that the men decide that they should do. They're not included in the decision making of where to place the well or the tap, and then it's only the women who go to fetch the water. So they are subjected to all sorts of risks, including a lot of sexual violence, because they go unaccompanied by themselves to these water taps that are unlit, dark, and so this is a good example of social violence. And then we come to this example of cultural violence, and in my experience of working in Nepal, I was there as a gender advisor quite recently during the earthquake, and I was really struck by this this event that took place over there, where reconstruction of buildings that had been destroyed during the earthquake, homes that had been destroyed during the earthquake. As you know, in
Yeah.
Nepal, they have a practice of isolating women when they're menstruating. And, you know, to give credit to the humanitarians, they were trying to work within the cultural boundaries of the country, and were thinking that they were being very sensitive to cultural issues, but they're not recognizing that some of them are harmful. So, because they didn't consult the collectives of women who had been working for years to eradicate some of these harmful cultural practices, they rebuilt the isolation rooms at the back of the house, which the women get relegated to when they're menstruating. And often these women are not fed properly, they are excluded from family during that time. And it is actually really quite a harmful practice. And the collectives of women had been trying for years to stop that. So what they had done inadvertently, obviously they didn't want to do that, but inadvertently they had re-emphasized a practice that had they included the women's collective, they would have known that they should not rebuild. So this is an example of how cultural, women are violated often by cultural practices. And if you're not sensitive to that and you don't actually involve collectives of women, you could make a huge mistake.
So then we come to examine the politics and violence. This photograph is 2006 Chadian and Sudan border. We are crossing the border as displaced people to becoming refugees from Sudan to Chad. Women were made to wait at the border, and this had various different challenges because that was the law between two countries, but also the humanitarian agencies didn't want to get involved because at one point there was the discussion to build shelters for women so they could have better protection from sun to all the other elements of their lives. However, the humanitarian agency's decision was, oh no, we don't want to get involved in a dispute between two countries.
Right. And I think, you and I had a big discussion about this politics and violence, because this is the crux of a lot of reasons why things don't change, is because the political element of the violence is not taken into account. So there are many different ways of looking at it. So there are the politics that is going on between the two sides that are, where the men are taking the decisions and the women are left to wait. But that's also part of the politics of patriarchy, where the women are excluded from being involved in the discussion. So the women are never part of those discussions about who gets to do what. And they are treated as, the subjects that have to just sit outside and wait for the men to decide who goes and who doesn't go and who does what. But also that their situation is not included. So the politics of patriarchy is that the women are not the same as the men. The women are targeted for patriarchal discrimination, gender discrimination. So these are the politics of violence, and violence against women are a very, very important part that often is left out of the humanitarian response, with the argument that we are here to save lives and we are not here to deal with the politics or the transformative part of, this must happen during development time. But actually, what we see is that there's opportunities in all of these situations for transformative actions to take place. So if the women were involved in any discussion, it would already be a transformation. It will be a transformative opportunity.
And also, I think from a political point of view, as an observer to politics, when we look at the field of peace building, the all the negotiations are still led and conducted by male peace builders. There are very few female peace builders, if you like. So there is that element at a global level as well.
Exactly.
So then we try to look at the economic violence, where again, Anu and I had a very long discussion about this, because already before any crisis, women were in disadvantaged positions when it comes to economic activities. But also, there is a hidden economic activity by women that most of the time um, we don't see in the bigger picture, like small garden farming to small scale shops to all the, even what they're doing within their families, how you could survive with $2 a day and feed 12 family members within your family is a huge economic contribution. And then when you look at within and after a crisis, with whether it's a relief operation or a reconstruction operation, the international agencies come and implement bigger livelihood activities, and suddenly the small scale but more effective economic activities conducted by women are being missed out.
In fact, and give you an example from the Philippines, because I was in the Philippines after the typhoon Haiyan, and there was a it was a glaring example of that, because women ran a whole range of small shops. They had a name for it which I don't remember, but they this was not taken into account when they were reconstituting the livelihoods, and they lost a huge income stream from these shops in the typhoon. So these women were not able to re-establish those shops. They were not, men were given boats to go back to fishing. There was a whole lot of livelihood rehabilitation of, the coconut farmers and all of that. But these were not taken into account, and yet it was a huge economic, stream of income that was neglected.
So then we come to environmental violence, and this is a photograph from tsunami affected eastern Sri Lanka after 2004. And also, what is important here is this was a conflict affected area as well. So the environment was such, the women and girls were again disadvantaged accessing resources in the and within the environment, whether it's water or anything else. So what happened with most relief operations, um, that women were confined to spaces while men would distribute water and other resources, and in that created a huge disparity and disadvantage for women and girls. So what we are what we have discussed here is very much from a wider social, political, cultural, economic, and environmental perspective, but we see this as contributing factors to health and well-being of women and girls within or after a crisis situation.
And I think what we're trying to say here is that we're looking at well-being as much more than just providing health services or giving women and girls access to health services, but that their well-being stretches across the social, political, cultural, environmental spheres. And so, therefore, it is really important that we don't think about transformation and well-being as something that happens in post-war, post-conflict, or in the aftermath, but that it actually should start immediately with the relief, and in fact should go beyond that and be worked at the prevention and risk reduction stages,
Yes.
because this is often a huge neglected area where the the risk reduction has maybe some small piece on gender and risk reduction, but is not mainstream throughout, where we really look at what could be done to prevent violence against women during crisis and in the aftermath, but also in that period itself. Because, basically, I mean, I think that this is something that I've been involved in for many years, where we've talked about the fact that there is no aftermath for women. This is a continuous situation of violence that we can work at any stage, at all stages.
And I think for international humanitarian structures, there is an opportunity to review of social, political, cultural, economic, and environmental traditions and practices within the context, but also in collaboration with women and girls as equal partners. And I think that's the big message we are trying to give away through this presentation.
And even more important, is to include collectives of women. Because in every situation, in every context, there always are women who have come together in solidarity to try and overcome some of these patriarchal discriminatory practices. I haven't been in any context where that didn't exist.
Exactly.
And these women are not included in the humanitarian response activities or decision making, and this would be really important.
So these are some of the references that we use for this presentation, but not limited to. Um, Thank you very much for listening to us. And these are our contacts. Please get in touch if you have any questions or if there is anything further you need to discuss.
Thank you and goodbye.